When we talk about attraction, most people focus on what is visible, words, actions, appearances. But what truly defines a shift in a person isn't always what you can see immediately. It's what you can feel. And this is where the first sign becomes incredibly important, the shift in emotional energy. You have to understand that intimacy is not just a physical act. It is, at its core, an emotional and psychological experience. Whether people admit it or not, it creates a release of tension, of anticipation, of desire. And when that release happens, it doesn't just disappear into thin air, it transforms the person's internal state. Before that moment, there is often a kind of restlessness, a searching energy, a subtle need for connection, validation, or stimulation. You'll notice it in how someone engages, how they speak, how they carry themselves. There's a certain edge, a kind of forward-leaning presence. But after that experience, that edge softens. What replaces it is something far quieter, but far more powerful, a sense of internal calm. And this is where most people get it wrong. They interpret this calmness as distance or even disinterest. But it's not that simple. It's not necessarily about you or anyone else in the environment. It's about the fact that in that moment, the person is no longer seeking. They've moved temporarily from a state of desire to a state of fulfillment. Think about that for a second. Human behavior is largely driven by what we feel we lack. When there's a gap, we move toward filling it, but when that gap is filled, even briefly, the urgency disappears. The emotional intensity drops, and what you're left with is a version of that person who feels complete, at least for that moment. You might notice it in small ways. She's quieter, but not in a negative way, more centered, less reactive. There's a groundedness to her presence that wasn't there before. It's subtle, but if you're paying attention, it's undeniable. This isn't about guilt. It's not about overthinking. In many cases, it's the opposite. It's the absence of inner conflict. The mind isn't racing. The emotions aren't pulling in different directions. There's a kind of alignment that shows up, and that alignment changes how she interacts with the world around her. And here's where it gets even more interesting. This shift isn't something she's consciously trying to project. It's not an act. In fact, the more genuine the experience, the less aware she is of the change. Because it's not coming from the surface, it's coming from within. People around her may feel it without being able to explain it. They might sense that something is different, but they can't quite put their finger on what it is. And that's because emotional energy doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself through presence. So if you're trying to understand behavior at a deeper level, you have to move beyond words. You have to start reading states, because states are what drive everything. Decisions, reactions, attraction. And the truth is, this shift in energy tells you more than any conversation ever could. It tells you where someone is internally, whether they are seeking or whether they are satisfied, whether they are open or whether they are momentarily complete within themselves. If you miss this, you'll misinterpret everything that follows. You'll assume distance where there is simply calm. You'll chase where there is no need to chase. And you'll create confusion where there was actually clarity. So the real question isn't just whether you can notice the shift. The real question is, can you understand it without reacting emotionally yourself? Because the moment you learn to read energy instead of just behavior, you stop guessing and you start seeing people for who they truly are in that moment, and that changes everything. Now, once you begin to understand that internal shift in emotional energy, the next layer becomes even more fascinating because it's the part people think they understand, but almost always misinterpret. It's that sudden glow. And no, this isn't about makeup, lighting, or appearance in the conventional sense. This is something deeper, something psychological that manifests physically. You've probably seen it before without realizing what you were actually witnessing. A woman walks into a room and there's just something different. She's not trying harder. She's not seeking attention. In fact, in many cases, she's doing less. And yet, paradoxically, she stands out more. That's not an accident. What you're observing is the external expression of an internal state. When a person experiences emotional and physical fulfillment, the body responds. Hormones shift. Stress levels drop. There's a release of tension, not just in the mind, but in the muscles, in posture, even in facial expressions. The face softens. The eyes become calmer, more present. The body language becomes more fluid, less rigid. And here's the key. This kind of presence cannot be performed. Most people, when they try to appear confident or attractive, they add something. They try to do more. They adjust their posture, control their expressions, rehearse their words. But real confidence, the kind that creates this glow, comes from subtraction. It comes from the absence of need. When there is nothing to prove, nothing to chase, nothing to validate, what's left is authenticity. And authenticity has a very distinct energy. It's effortless. It doesn't demand attention, yet it naturally draws it. This is why the glow feels so different from surface level attraction. It's not loud. It's not exaggerated. It's quiet, grounded, and deeply rooted in how someone feels about themselves in that moment. And when a woman has just experienced a genuine connection, that internal alignment reflects outwardly in ways she doesn't even realize. Now, from a psychological perspective, this is powerful because human beings are wired to respond to congruence. When someone's internal state matches their external behavior, it creates a sense of trust and intrigue. People may not consciously think she seems fulfilled, but they feel that she is different. More at ease, more certain, more complete, and that completeness is magnetic. But here's where most people make a critical mistake. They assume the glow is something they can replicate by copying behaviors. They think it's about smiling a certain way, dressing better, or acting more confident. But you cannot fake a state that you have not genuinely experienced. You might imitate the surface, but the depth will always be missing. Because the glow is not created by effort, it's revealed when effort disappears. It's what happens when someone is no longer operating from a place of lack. When the internal dialogue quiets down, when the need for approval, attention, or validation temporarily fades into the background. In that space, a person becomes naturally present, and presence, more than anything else, is what people are drawn to. You'll also notice something subtle but important. There's less overreaction, less emotional volatility. She's not easily pulled into unnecessary drama or distractions, not because she's forcing herself to stay composed, but because her internal state doesn't require external stimulation to feel stable. This creates a kind of psychological independence that is incredibly rare, and rarity, by its very nature, increases perceived value. So when you see that glow, understand what you're really looking at. You're not just seeing attractiveness. You're seeing alignment. You're seeing a moment where someone's internal world is at ease, and that ease is expressing itself outwardly in a way that feels natural, not constructed. And if you truly want to understand attraction at a deeper level, you have to shift your focus. Stop looking at what people are doing and start paying attention to what they are being, because what someone is being will always communicate more than what they are trying to show. The real takeaway here is simple, but not easy. If you want to create a presence that draws people in, you don't start by changing your behavior. You start by changing your state, because when your state is aligned, you don't have to chase attention. Attention finds you. Once you grasp the shift in emotional energy and you begin to recognize that quiet, unforced glow, the third layer becomes almost inevitable. And for many people, this is where confusion really starts to build. Because what follows is a noticeable reduction in the need for attention and validation. Now think about how most interactions operate on a day-to-day basis. Beneath the surface, there's often a subtle exchange happening, people seeking acknowledgement, approval, or affirmation. It's not always obvious, but it's there in the way conversations are steered, in the way conversations are anticipated, even in the way silence can feel uncomfortable. That underlying need is temporarily fulfilled. Something shifts. A woman who has recently experienced genuine emotional and physical connection often moves, at least for a while, out of that seeking state. The constant pull for validation, whether it's through attention, compliments, or engagement, begins to fade. And when that fades, her behavior naturally changes. She may post less, engage less, respond with less urgency, not because she's playing games, and not because she's trying to create distance, but because internally there's simply less to prove. And this is where many people misread the situation. They interpret the reduced engagement as disinterest or rejection. They assume something has gone wrong, or that they've somehow lost value in her eyes. But in reality, what they're witnessing has very little to do with them. It has everything to do with her internal state. When someone feels emotionally full, even temporarily, their dependence on external input decreases. The mind isn't scanning for reassurance. It's not looking for signals to confirm worth or desirability. Instead, there's a quiet sense of I'm okay as I am. And from that place, behavior becomes more selective, more intentional. This is a critical point to understand because it flips the entire dynamic of how most people approach attraction. They assume that more attention creates more interest, that if they engage more, message more, show more, they will pull the other person closer. But when someone is already in a fulfilled state, excess attention doesn't increase attraction. It can actually create imbalance. Why? Because attraction is deeply tied to emotional contrast. When one person is seeking and the other is not, the dynamic becomes uneven, and people feel that imbalance, even if they can't articulate it. So what you start to see is a woman who is less reactive to external stimuli. She's not jumping into every conversation. She's not chasing every opportunity for engagement. There's a level of restraint, not forced, but natural, that comes from feeling internally satisfied. And that restraint, ironically, can make her even more intriguing because human nature is wired to notice what is not easily available. When someone doesn't need your attention, when they're not actively seeking your validation, it creates a kind of psychological tension. It makes people lean in, question, observe more closely. But again, this isn't strategy, it's stage. She's not pulling back to create attraction. She's pulling back because in that moment, she doesn't need anything from the outside to feel complete. And that's a powerful position to be in. Now, here's the deeper lesson. This dynamic doesn't just apply to one situation or one type of interaction. It reflects a broader truth about human behavior. The more you rely on external validation, the more your actions are driven by need. And the more your actions are driven by need, the less grounded and authentic they become. On the other hand, when you cultivate a sense of internal fulfillment, when you reduce your dependence on outside approval, you naturally become more selective, more composed, more in control of your responses. And that shift changes everything. Because people don't just respond to what you say or do, they respond to the energy behind it. They can feel when you're trying to get something from them, and they can feel when you're already whole within yourself. So instead of focusing on how to gain more attention, the real question becomes, how do you reach a point where you need less of it? Because the paradox is this: the less you need validation, the more naturally it comes to you. Not because you're chasing it, but because you're no longer dependent on it. And when you reach that point, you're no longer reacting to the world around you. You're operating from a place of inner stability that others can't help but notice. By the time you understand the shift in energy, the quiet confidence, and the reduced need for validation, the next change becomes almost impossible to ignore. Yet, it's the one most people misread the fastest. It shows up in communication, in the way she texts, responds, engages, or sometimes doesn't. And here's where things get interesting, because communication is where people look for certainty. They analyze response times, tone, word choice, emojis, enthusiasm. They try to decode meaning from patterns. But what they often fail to realize is that communication is not just about intention, it's a reflection of state. When a woman's internal state shifts from seeking to feeling fulfilled, her communication naturally follows that shift. Before that, there may have been a certain lightness, a playfulness, a curiosity driving the interaction. Faster replies, more questions, a sense of emotional availability that keeps the conversation moving forward. But once that internal need is temporarily satisfied, the urgency disappears. And when urgency disappears, so does the pressure to engage at the same level. You might notice that responses become slower. Not dramatically, but enough to feel different. The tone might become more neutral, less flirtatious, less emotionally charged. Conversations that once flowed effortlessly may now feel more spaced out, more controlled, almost as if there's an invisible boundary that wasn't there before. Now, the mistake most people make is taking this personally. They assume the shift in communication is a reflection of their value. They start questioning what they said, what they did, where they went wrong. And in doing so, they react. They try to compensate. They double text, over explain, increase effort, all in an attempt to restore the previous dynamic. But this reaction is exactly what creates the disconnect. Because again, the shift you're observing isn't necessarily about you, it's about her state. When someone is no longer driven by the need for stimulation or validation, their communication becomes more intentional. They engage when they want to, not when they feel they need to. That distinction is everything. Need-based communication is reactive. It seeks to maintain connection at all costs. But state-based communication is selective. It prioritizes internal alignment over external consistency. And when someone operates from that place, their responses may become less predictable, but more authentic. You'll also notice something subtle in the emotional tone. There's less volatility, fewer highs and lows. The conversation may feel calmer, even slightly detached at times. Not cold, not dismissive, just less invested in creating emotional spikes. And that can be confusing, especially if you've become accustomed to intensity. But here's the deeper truth. Intensity is often mistaken for connection, when in reality, true emotional stability doesn't need constant stimulation to sustain itself. It exists quietly without demanding attention. So when her communication shifts, it's not necessarily a loss of interest. It's a reflection of a more grounded internal state. She's no longer reaching outward in the same way because she doesn't feel the same internal pull, and this is where your awareness matters. If you respond to this shift with insecurity, you amplify the imbalance. You move into a seeking state while she remains in a settled one. And that contrast creates tension, not the kind that builds attraction, but the kind that creates distance. But if you understand what's happening, you respond differently. You don't chase the old dynamic. You don't try to force the same level of engagement. Instead, you match the energy, not by mirroring behavior, but by stabilizing your own state. Because ultimately, communication is not about maintaining a constant level of interaction. It's about alignment. It's about two people operating from compatible states, not competing needs. And when you begin to see communication through that lens, everything changes. You stop overanalyzing messages. You stop reacting emotionally to delays or shifts in tone. You start recognizing patterns for what they are, expressions of internal states, not personal judgments. That level of understanding gives you control, not over the other person, but over yourself. And that's the real power here, because the moment you stop chasing consistency in others and start cultivating stability within yourself, you become far less affected by these shifts. You observe them, you understand them, but you don't lose your center because of them. And that's when communication stops being a source of confusion and starts becoming a window into truth. So the next time you notice a change in how someone communicates, don't rush to interpret it as rejection. Ask yourself a better question. What state is this person in right now? And more importantly, what state am I choosing to respond from? Because the quality of your response will always matter more than the timing of theirs. By now, you can start to see the pattern. First, there's a shift in emotional energy. Then comes that quiet, effortless glow. After that, a reduced need for validation, followed by subtle changes in communication. And naturally, all of this leads to something deeper, something that often goes unnoticed until it directly affects you. Increased selectiveness and stronger boundaries. This is where the dynamic truly changes, because when a woman moves into a state of internal fulfillment, even temporarily, her tolerance for unnecessary interactions drops. Not out of arrogance, not out of disrespect, but out of clarity. She becomes more aware, more intentional about where her time, energy, and attention go. Before this shift, there may have been more openness, more willingness to entertain conversations, respond to messages, engage with different people, even if those interactions weren't deeply meaningful. That openness often comes from a subtle desire to feel something connect, sticks, excitement, validation. But once that desire is met, even briefly, the filter tightens, and this is where boundaries begin to emerge more clearly. She may start saying no more often, either directly or indirectly. She may take longer to respond, not as a tactic, but because responding is no longer a priority. She may disengage from conversations that feel shallow or unnecessary. And most importantly, she becomes less available to people who don't align with her current state. Now, for someone on the receiving end, this can feel like rejection. It can feel like a sudden wall has gone up where there used to be openness. And the instinctive reaction is often to push harder to try to break through that boundary, to regain access, to return things to how they were before. But that approach almost always backfires, because boundaries are not obstacles to overcome, they are signals to understand. When someone becomes more selective, what they are really communicating is this: my energy has value, and I'm choosing where to invest it. And that choice is not random. It's guided by how they feel internally. When someone feels grounded and fulfilled, they are far less willing to compromise that state for interactions that don't add to it. This is a level of self-respect that many people struggle to maintain consistently. And here's the deeper insight: selectiveness is not about excluding others. It's about protecting alignment. When a person is aligned internally, they become highly sensitive to anything that disrupts that alignment. Conversations that feel forced, attention that feels needy, dynamics that feel unbalanced, all of these become more noticeable and therefore easier to step away from. So what you're seeing isn't distance for the sake of distance. It's discernment, and discernment is one of the strongest indicators of emotional awareness. Now, this also creates an interesting psychological effect. The more selective someone becomes, the more their attention feels valuable, because it's no longer freely given. It's earned through genuine alignment, not effort or persistence. But again, this is not a strategy. It's a byproduct of state. She's not thinking, I need to be more selective to increase my value. She's simply responding to how she feels. And because she feels internally stable, she doesn't feel the need to overextend herself externally. That's the difference between someone who is trying to create boundaries and someone who naturally has them. One is effort, the other is identity. And if you really want to understand attraction, you have to pay attention to that difference. Because people don't just respond to what you allow, they respond to what you embody. If you tolerate everything, if you engage with everyone, if your attention is constantly available, it loses weight. But when your attention is guided by clarity, when it is given with intention rather than impulse, it carries significance. So when you encounter the shift, when you feel those boundaries becoming more defined, the question is not how to break them. The question is whether you align with them. Because the truth is, the right people don't experience boundaries as barriers. They experience them as filters that naturally include them, and that brings you to a powerful realization. You don't build meaningful connection by forcing access. You build it by becoming someone who naturally fits within the other person's space. So instead of reacting to selectiveness with frustration or insecurity, use it as feedback. It's showing you the level of awareness and alignment the other person is operating from, and the real opportunity is not to change their boundaries, but to elevate your own standards. Because the moment you begin to value your time, your energy, and your presence at the same level, everything shifts. You stop chasing access and you start attracting alignment. And that is where real connection begins. And when you step back and connect all the pieces, the shift in energy, the quiet glow, the reduced need for validation, the change in communication, the stronger boundaries, you arrive at the final layer. The one that doesn't announce itself loudly, but reveals everything. If you're paying attention, a quiet, unspoken satisfaction. This is the most subtle sign, yet in many ways, it's the most powerful. Because it doesn't rely on what is said or done, it exists in what is felt. It's the presence of someone who, at least for that moment, is internally at ease. You'll notice it in the smallest details. A slight smile that appears without reason. A calmness in her eyes that isn't searching for anything. Moments where she seems mentally somewhere else. Not distracted in a negative sense, but simply not pulled by everything happening around her. There's a softness, a kind of inner stillness that replaces the usual noise. And this is where most people completely miss what's happening. They assume that engagement equals interest, that responsiveness equals attraction, that visible excitement equals emotional investment. But what they fail to recognize is that true satisfaction is often quiet. It doesn't need to express itself loudly because it isn't trying to convince anyone of anything, it just exists. When someone reaches that state, even temporarily, their relationship with the external world changes. They are less reactive, less impulsive, less driven by the need to create or maintain stimulation. They don't feel the urge to fill every silence, respond to every message, or chase every interaction, because internally, there's nothing missing that needs to be filled. And that's a rare position to be in. Most people operate from a baseline of subtle dissatisfaction, a constant sense that something is lacking, even if they can't define it. And that underlying feeling drives behavior, seeking attention, creating conversations, looking for validation, chasing emotional highs. But when that baseline shifts, even briefly, you see a completely different version of the person. One that is grounded, present, unbothered. And here's the key. This kind of satisfaction is not something that can be convincingly faked. You can imitate confidence. You can perform happiness. But genuine inner contentment has a consistency to it that goes beyond surface behavior. It shows up in how someone carries silence, how they respond to pressure, how little they need from others in that moment. It's not about withdrawing. It's about being complete enough that interaction becomes a choice, not a necessity. Now, from a psychological standpoint, this creates a very specific effect on the people around her because humans are naturally drawn to what feels stable and self-contained. When someone doesn't seem to need anything from you, it changes how you perceive them. Their presence feels heavier, more significant, because it isn't driven by demand. But at the same time, it can also create uncertainty. Because if you're used to reading people through their reactions, through how much they engage, how quickly they respond, how intensely they express interest, then this quiet satisfaction becomes difficult to interpret. It doesn't give you the usual signals. It doesn't follow the expected patterns. And that's where emotional intelligence becomes critical. Because understanding this state requires you to move beyond surface level cues and start recognizing internal alignment. It requires you to become comfortable with stillness, with subtlety, with the absence of constant feedback. And more importantly, it challenges you to low, okay at yourself. Because the real question is not just whether you can recognize this quiet satisfaction in someone else. It's whether you can create it within yourself. Can you reach a point where your sense of fulfillment doesn't depend on external input, where your emotional state isn't constantly reacting to what others say or do, where your presence feels grounded regardless of the environment around you? Because that's the real power behind everything we've talked about. All of these signs, all of these shifts, they are not just observations to decode someone else's behavior. They are reflections of a deeper principle that true influence, true attraction, true connection all begin with internal state. And when you cultivate that state within yourself, something remarkable happens. You stop chasing reactions, you stop needing constant reassurance. You stop overanalyzing every interaction, you become steady. And in a world where most people are driven by noise, by need, by constant motion, that kind of steadiness stands out more than anything else. So don't just look for these signs in others. Use them as a mirror, because the moment you learn to create that quiet, unshakable satisfaction within yourself, you don't just understand human behavior, you master your place within it. And that's where everything changes.